holidays and things like that. All right, well, let's get into our next lecture called Counting the Centuries. We need to know what these abbreviations mean. AD, BC, BP, these are all commonly seen in our literature, but not so common as today. AD means Anno Domini, which is the year of our Lord, and in the Gregorian calendar, this was put in to denote the beginning of the new Gregorian calendar, starting with the year 0, which was corresponding to the birth of Jesus. BC is before Christ, before Jesus, and that was commonly used for centuries. But today we live in a much more diverse world, so that has been changed, because in other cultures that are non-Christian, that reference doesn't really make much sense for them. So to have more of a common definition in the Gregorian calendar, we now use CE, which means Common Era, or BCE, before the Common Era. So it's still the year 0, but it's now more adaptable to all the different religious groups and countries around the world. Now you can abbreviate CE in a lot of different ways, but my preferred way is the two capital letters put together. So CE or BCE capitalized. That's the way I like to do it. But you feel free to do it any way you like. So we don't use BC anymore. We use BCE. We don't use AD anymore. We use CE, just to have a more common way of communicating. Also, you'll see now and again BP, which means before the present. That means today. So just as an example, if we're talking about 30,000 years BP, or 30,000 years before the present, we're really talking about 28,000 BCE, because it's been 2,020 years since the year 0. Also, you'll see this little C, usually with a period there, and it's a Latin word for cerca, or it means close. So close to this date, where we're not sure of the exact date, and so much in history is totally uncertain in terms of exact dates. The letter C, a short abbreviation for the Latin word cerca, which means to be close. All right, so those are just some things you'll need to know as you do your reading. Now, we also have to count the centuries. A century is 100 years. You remember the Roman legion had centurions who were over 100 soldiers, that kind of thing. Now, centuries are counted in a different way. If you look at the little graph here in blue, the first century is the year 1 to year 100. So the year 98 or 52 would be in the first century. The second century is from 101 to 200. So 153, for example, would be in the second century. The third century, well, 201 to 300, so the year 203 would be in the third century. So let's go back up a line, and the year 1582, the year the Gregorian calendar came into existence, that's in the 16th century. So 1582 is in the 16th century. Our year today, 2020, is in the 21st century. So you need to know that if you're going to understand the readings and the lecture from here on in, because today's lecture is going to give you a skeleton of world history. In other words, we're going to give you 5 periods of history that are all lumped together to help us study these different phases of history. They're clearly different from each other. Now, these 5 are like ribs on a skeleton. When you know where this rib fits, you can flesh this out and build upon it and remember it. So let's start with the first period, which is called prehistoric. Now, prehistoric, we're not going to spend a lot of time on that, but it basically means prehistory. And what do we mean by that? This was before writing. Before writing was invented, well, we can't record history if we don't have writing. So when we say something is prehistoric in a history class, we're saying it was before the invention and use of writing, where people could tell their story and their history in a written form. So somewhere between 250,000 BCE to 3,500 BCE would be considered the prehistoric era. This was, of course, a time when there were great migrations of people. They were evolving, of course. They were doing a lot of things, domesticating animals, inventing fire, the wheel, all sorts of things like that. And the beginning of humanity, Homo sapiens sapiens, would have been in Botswana in southern Africa along the Zambezi River, and then growing and moving and migrating through the course of 250,000 years up into what we now call Europe, or into Asia, even down into Australia, New Zealand, and New Guinea, and then across into North America by the year 15,000 to 12,000. Okay, so we're going to spend very little time on prehistory, but we will spend a little bit of time. The next phase of history we will spend a little bit more time in, and it's ancient history. So our ancient history begins roughly with the invention of writing in 4 separate places in the world in around 3,500 to about 500 BCE. All right, now this ancient time would be the invention of 4 cultures, 4 different regions, all along rivers, creating agricultural paradises, if you will, and creating agricultural surplus, which allowed a larger population to live together and to grow together, and it created the development of cities and things like that. This was the invention of civilization, and it was invented in 4 places. In Mesopotamia, somewhere between, and we're using the word circa here now, between 5,000 and 3,500 BCE. Egypt came along a bit later, 5,000 to 3,000 BCE. In the Indus River Valley in India, the 4,000 to 2,700 BC, and then in China, along the Huanghe River, would be around 3,000 to 2,000 BCE. All of these are the cradles of civilization in the world. They were separated from each other. Did they know about each other? Yes, there was some trade between. They had some influences a little bit, but for the most part, they tended to be very isolated places. The most famous is Egypt from our perspective, and that's because so many things still exist, like the Great Pyramids. Now, they, of course, built in stone, and that's why they lasted so long. But we're talking about buildings that are 5,000 years old. After our ancient civilizations, we now go into what we call the classical period. And especially now we're talking about the classical period in Western history, in terms of Western European history, the Mediterranean history, and the Middle East. The classical period goes from 500 BCE to 500 CE. Now, this period is exemplified by the rise of new forms of government, new forms of leadership. Whereas before, you'd have your isolated kingdom, if you will, like Egypt or Mesopotamia or the Indus River Valley. A man by the name of Cyrus the Great, who lived in Persia, which is current-day Iran, Cyrus the Great would unify 3 of the ancient civilizations into one great empire. And this really had never been seen before. There were little mini empires, there were little mini kingdoms, but to unify them all into one great big entity was a very new thing. And it also contributed to the rise of trade, of stability, of growth in the economy, and a rise in population. In fact, this Persian Empire would have started trading too with China along a new thing that was developing called the Silk Route, because in China they had invented silk and it was being traded, and other things too. So there was some trade in between all this. But this is a whole new thing. And this Persian Empire was growing and expanding, and they ran smack dab into a group called the Greeks. Now, the Greeks were developing their civilization throughout all this time, and they were fiercely independent. And when the Persians began to push in on their territory, well, there was a big fight. And we remember a lot of the stories of this great fight between the Persians and the Greeks. You may have heard about the 300 Spartans, the army that held off the Persians tens of thousands every day for 3 days at the Battle of Thermopylae. Now, Athens, also a Greek city-state, had a navy led by a man by the name of Themistocles, who then destroyed the Persian fleet off the coast of Athens. Those two events put them together a few battles later, and the Persians were pushed out of Greece forever, frankly. All right, well, this allowed Greece to develop in its own way, and especially Athens to go on to become a little empire of its own. And this right here created a flourish of thought and science and technology and literature and philosophy and theater and so many things that became part of the culture of Western Europe, Western society, and the Middle East as well, became available to everybody in Greece. And this person you see here depicted is Pericles, who helped rebuild Athens after the war with the Persians. And he built a magnificent new city, which became more or less the intellectual capital of the West for quite a long time. But Greeks being Greeks, they decide to fight amongst themselves. And I'm just giving you a short summary here, but the Spartans, who lived more on this peninsula called the Peloponnesus, they would get into a conflict with Athens, which was right here. Athens Empire stretched through all this area in orange, you can see. Quite profitable, quite productive. But there were those that were lined up against that, and they started a series of wars called the Peloponnesian Wars. And Athens would win that with the help of, guess who? The Persians. All right, now, Greece continued to change and to grow, and later another king in northern Greece, in Macedonia, put together quite an army, and then, of course, he died, leaving it to his young son by the name of Alexander. And Alexander the Great, 100 years after the great battles between Athens and Sparta and the Persians, decided to take out after the Persian Empire and attack them instead of waiting to be attacked. And when he did, he conquered the Persian Empire and even went further than the Persian Empire. His empire was even bigger. It didn't last long because as a young man, around 33, he returns to his new capital city of Babylon right here and dies quickly. And his great empire, after an amazing conquest, still talked about today, was divided up among his generals. So it didn't last long, but it was quite a moment. But what was important about it is that Greek philosophy, thought, and ideas were spread throughout this part of the world. And that laid the seeds for future Western thought. All right, well, this is a time that gave rise to Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle, and many, many, many other important philosophers, mathematicians, and what we would call today scientists. The expansion of Greek thought started in the Hellenic Age. Hellenic, meaning Greek, the Greek Age, starts at about 507 BCE and stretches through the first democracy in Athens until about 323 BCE. At that point, with the rise of Alexander the Great, it changes. It exports this across this whole region, led by the armies of Alexander, and this now becomes known as the Hellenistic Age. And the Hellenistic Age, in the classical period of history, the Hellenistic Age, would go from 323 to 31. And at this point, a new empire had emerged, the Roman Empire, and around 31 BCE, which is about the time of Julius Caesar, we would see a big change, where for the next 500 years, it will be Rome that will dominate the world, the military, the economy, the society, the social life of the Mediterranean, and basically conquer Greece and make it part of its vast empire. It would conquer Greece as well. All right, well, Rome, where did it start? It started early, 509 BCE, but around 31, it goes through a big change and becomes this new powerhouse in the Mediterranean. It was founded when they set up some laws called the 12 Tablets of the Law, the foundation of Roman law, the centerpiece of what we would call today a constitution of a republic. They hated monarchs. They hated monarchy, so they instead invested power in a Roman Senate. A group of people, very wealthy, very powerful, but this group ran the Roman Empire for the first 500 years. And so this is where we get our idea of a republic here in the United States. We get our idea of a democracy from Athens in ancient Greece. Who changed everything? Well, Julius Caesar, of course. Along he comes and establishes himself as emperor, and things very much changed after that. As you know, he's assassinated by the senators who were jealous of his new authority and gets stabbed literally in the back. Now, this caused a great civil war in Rome. Two contending armies went after each other, and eventually the winner pronounced himself as Augustus Caesar. And Augustus then consolidated the empire, which now stretched from England all the way to Jerusalem and across North Africa, and this entity really solidified and reached its height. It was very rich, very wealthy. It was probably the wealthiest place on earth at the time. So this is a period we call Pax Romana, or the period of Roman peace. So the period we now call classical more or less starts to come to a close with the reign of Constantine the Great. Constantine the Great also got into a civil war 300 years after Augustus, and he won that war with the help of Christians. Christians, of course, came to be around the time of Augustus. Between 27 BCE and 14 CE, they emerged as a small group, but over the next 300 years, they would grow and grow and grow. They weren't a majority in Rome yet, but this guy, Constantine the Great, depended on them for his armies. And also, he was looking for a way to basically modernize, if you want to call it that, the Roman religion and society. And so he basically then abandoned all of the gods of the past, Jupiter, Saturn, Venus, and so on. They were what we call polytheistic, worshiped many gods, and went to this new Christian religion. And this here you can see is Greek for Christos. Here is a coin of Constantine, and also the symbol of Christianity in Greek is this symbol here. And he built the greatest church ever built in terms of the Christian world, St. Hagia Sophia, which is now in Istanbul, Turkey. All right, well, near that same city, the Romans didn't know what Christianity was. They were pagans. They worshipped Jupiter. They worshipped Sol Invictus. They had lots of different things going on. So they brought together the Christian bishops from around the Roman world and asked them to basically write down what it is that they should be practicing. It starts with a thing called the Nicene Creed, and it's a profession of faith, widely used, the most widely used Christian liturgy. This is like what you say in church, what you practice in church, the teachings, if you will. And they did this in the first ecumenical council, which met in 325 CE. They also corresponded the church law with the Roman law. And what you should understand about the ancient world and the classical world and even the medieval world is that there's no separation of church and state. They're one and the same. So the church supports the government supports the church, and it's all one thing. For example, collections, taxes, if you will, offerings were collected throughout the Roman Empire for the temples of Jupiter and others. Even the current Augustus, the emperor, also was worshipped as a god, and they would take in offerings for them too. After this period, funding is cut for all of the pagan gods or the old gods, and all the money went into developing churches and temples for the Christian faith. The Christians then had it out for the pagans, the polytheists, and people that disagreed with Christianity, called heretics. And so there was quite a struggle. And so the conversion of Rome didn't happen in a day. It took a few hundred years. But a lot of the things that were pagan, like a lot of the Greek writings and philosophy and so on, were basically torched. They were destroyed. Some of the great Apollo statue was torn down. The great statue of Jupiter in Greece was torn down. And so things started to change as they became basically one religion in the Roman Empire. Here, for example, is a model of what the Temple of Jupiter would have looked like, and before long, funding is cut for it, and so they can't maintain it, and it eventually evolves into a Christian temple of worship. All right, well, the Roman Empire lasted another, 400 or 500 years, depending on who you're counting, and then they start to collapse. Besieged by invasions from all sides, Rome in the west, the western part of Rome, goes into deep decline. The economy collapsed along with the safety and security of the empire, and the only way you could maintain your security was to depend on some local warlord, some chief who now owned the property that he stole from the Romans, and now if you were a peasant, you had to work for that person under their rules, so to speak. And everything became localized in what we call now the medieval period. So with the collapse of Rome in the West, we get 1,000 years of the Middle Ages. Medieval period is the best term for historians to use. Sometimes this is called the Dark Ages and so on, but medieval is probably the proper term. In medieval society, things broke down into much smaller units, kingdoms, shires, where you've had barons that owned a certain estate and people in that area worked for them. And you see these small little entities where you didn't before. The local leader would have been the lord of the area, the nobleman. He would have soldiers, and then the peasants would produce the food and build the buildings and run everything in terms of the economy, and then that would feed back up to the noblemen, who could make quite a good life for themselves. But it was a local thing instead of a empire thing where you could trade across an empire. Now you basically just took care of your own needs in your local area. The only real surviving entity of the Romans at this time was the Roman Catholic Church. It continued to convert people to Christianity and thrive during this time. All right, well, it would thrive until the rise of Islam in 622. And in about a 100-year period, Islam expanded and grew. And Christianity, which had once dominated all the rim of the entire Mediterranean, was now pushed and pulled and tucked into basically this part of Europe, and down here, this part of what we now call the Byzantine Empire. This was a real, if you will, cutting off of certain Christians from the centers of Christianity, which would have been Constantinople and Rome, and a new religion, the fastest growing religion in world history, Islam, was born. Islam went through a huge, how should we say it, cultural revolution. They adopted all the Greek science and technology and improved on it. For example, they improved mathematics by inventing the zero. If you look at some subjects you might have to study, like algebra, if it has AL in front of it, it means it's Arabic in origin. And so we have a new player in the medieval scene. They established libraries. They set up their own law. Remember, there's no separation of church and state. The great University of Baghdad was the first of its kind in the medieval world. And Christianity had its own struggles. It split between Eastern Church and Western Church. The Eastern Church, Patriarch of Constantinople, we're talking about the Greek Orthodox Church here, the Russian Orthodox Church, and so on, and the Roman Catholic Church in the West here in orange, as you can see. All right, so this is called a schism or a split. In the middle of all this, we want to talk about Dionysius Exiguus. Now, this man was Dionysius the Humble. Around 525, he thinks maybe we shouldn't use the Julian calendar's method of going back nearly 1,000 years to the beginning of Rome to start the calendar. So in a search for finding when Easter actually fell on the calendar, he did a lot of mathematical study, he did a lot of research, and he proposed, why don't we just change the calendar to read Anno Domini, year of our Lord, and start with 0, the birth of Christ, and then before Christ would be all BC, and he was the person who came up with that idea, and it stuck, and it would last until about the current last century, and now of course we use CE and BCE. All right, well, that's pretty much our lecture for today. Hope you enjoyed it. It's a fascinating time, but the goal of today was simply to break down ancient society from prehistoric society, classical society, and medieval society, and next time we'll talk about modern society.